news is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, it's 6 o'clock. I'm Michelle Dewberry, and this is Dewbs & Co, the show where we'll get into some of the things that have got you talking today. And so it's official. England is finally going to live with COVID. Out go the government restrictions, and in comes personal responsibility. I say fantastic news, but do you agree with me? And the head of MI5 has said that the UK faces a fight to keep our way of life. He says we need to stand up for our values, our system, and our democratic way of life. I couldn't agree more. And gambling. Over 2 million people in the UK have some form of gambling addiction. And now, get this, the NHS has rejected the industry funding which helps treat these people, and instead, we, the rest of the taxpayers, will pick up the bill. Why? Well, because the patients receiving the treatment were uncomfortable using services paid for by the gambling industry. Personally, I'm not going to lie, I found that bonkers. Am I wrong? And what about students? You know, they've had to pay full tuition fees over this pandemic, and given how much of their learning was done remotely, I say, should they have done? No, if you ask me. Especially, by the way, when I see that some of the money that universities have been making over the pandemic and how much they have received in taxpayers' furlough. I reckon students should be getting some refunds. Do you agree with me? All of that to come and more, but first, the latest news headlines. Good evening, I'm Tamsin Roberts in the GB newsroom. The legal requirement to isolate after a positive coronavirus test will end on Thursday in England, and free universal testing will end on April the 1st. Unveiling his new plan for living with COVID, Boris Johnson said all remaining domestic restrictions would be removed. Routine contact tracing will end, and school pupils will no longer have to test twice a week. The Prime Minister said the country will now rely on vaccines and treatments to tackle the virus.
We now have sufficient levels of immunity to complete the transition from protecting people with government interventions to relying on vaccines and treatments as our first line of defence. We will encourage people with COVID-19 symptoms to exercise personal responsibility, just as we encourage people who may have flu to be considerate to others.
Well, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said the plans will leave England vulnerable.
The Prime Minister promised to present a plan for living with COVID. But all we've got today is yet more chaos and disarray. Not enough to prepare us for the new variants which may yet develop. An approach which seems to think that living with COVID means simply ignoring it.
Well, the UK will offer an additional COVID-19 booster jab from spring for the most vulnerable. People aged 75 years and over, residents in care homes for the elderly, and people aged 12 years and over who are immunosuppressed will be eligible. These groups will be able to receive their fourth jab from around 6 months after their last dose. Health Secretary Sajid Javid said all 4 parts of the UK intend to follow the advice from the Independent Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. Well, the Prime Minister will lead a news conference on the plan for living with COVID at 7 o'clock. He'll be joined by England's Chief Medical Officer, Professor Sir Chris Whitty, and the government's Chief Scientific Advisor, Professor Sir Patrick Vallance. And, of course, we'll bring it to you here live. In other news, Russia's Presidential Security Council is considering recognising the independence of 2 Russian-backed separatist regions in eastern Ukraine.
It follows televised appeals by leaders of the rebel-held Donetsk Republic and Luhansk Republic. Vladimir Putin says Russia is not considering annexing the two regions and formally adding them to its own territory. He's due to make a statement shortly. But Defence Secretary Ben Wallace told the Commons Britain has a strong cause for concern that Russia is still committed to an invasion of Ukraine.
In the last 48 hours, contrary to Kremlin assurances, we have seen a continued increase in troop numbers and a change in force disposition, moving from holding areas to potential launch locations. I believe he is in danger of setting himself on a tragic course of events, leading to a humanitarian crisis, instability and widespread suffering, not just of Ukrainians, but also of the Russian people.
Just under 30,000 homes are still without power due to the impact of storms Dudley, Eunice and Franklin. That's according to Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng. He's told the House of Commons that energy companies are working as quickly as they can to restore power to affected homes across the UK. Meanwhile, transport networks have suffered further delays, with some train operators asking passengers not to travel because of the conditions. An investigation into childcare services in Solihull has found that some details were entered incorrectly into police databases, leaving children at risk of potential harm. The investigation was launched after 6-year-old Arthur Labinjo Hughes was murdered in 2020. In a number of safeguarding cases, officers in Solihull were found to be over-optimistic and lacked professional curiosity. Investigators reported examples of separate records being made for the same individual because of spelling errors in their name, and children not being linked to the system to family relatives who could pose a risk to them. There's a new drive to help uncover Britain's working class history. Historic England have announced that local communities can apply for grants of up to £25,000 to fund research projects. The aim is to research everyday history in places like railways, council estates and pubs. The project is the first of a series planned for the next 3 years, exploring the diversity of England's heritage. This is GB News on TV, online and DAB+ radio. That's all from me for now. Now it's back to Dewbs & Co.
Thanks for that. Well, keeping me company tonight until 7 o'clock. My panel, we've got Dan Hodges, who's a commentator at the Mail on Sunday, Scarlett Maguire, who's the former Labour advisor, and James Woodhousen, who's a visiting professor at London's South Bank University. And you know the drill on Dewbs & Co. It's not just about us here and our thoughts, it's about you at home as well and yours. What is on your mind tonight and what do you think about the stories that we are discussing? And of course, if you're sitting there thinking, hang about, why isn't she talking about this? Then tell me. You can get in touch on email, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet me at Michelle Dewbs or at GBNews. And by the way, we're everywhere when it comes to social media, including on YouTube. Some of you might be watching there. Good evening to you if you are, and if you're not and you didn't even know we was on there, well, yes, we are. You can go and subscribe. You'll get alerts when we're about to start and everything. Top technology, I can tell you. Anyway, by the way, in fact, no, I was just about to tell you about a poll, but if you follow me on Twitter, you might have seen the poll. I'm running a poll to ask you, do you think it is time for England to live with COVID? I told you, I certainly do. But get on my Twitter at GB News or at Michelle Dewbs and tell me your thoughts, and I'll read them out before the end of the show. But Prime Minister Boris Johnson has announced that self-isolation will end in England on Thursday. Free universal testing will also end on April the 1st, but the government will continue to provide free tests for symptomatic people, for the oldest age groups and those who are most vulnerable. Let's have a little listen to what he was saying earlier on in Parliament.
And while the pandemic is not over, we have now passed the peak of the Omicron wave, with cases falling, hospitalisations in England now fewer than 10,000 and still falling, and the link between infection and severe disease substantially weakened.
Now, the opposition leader, Keir Starmer, didn't agree with the plan to lift restrictions. Surprise, surprise, some might say. He said it would leave the country vulnerable. Let's have a listen.
As a nation, there is no doubt we need to move on from COVID. People need to know their liberties are returning and returning for good. But this is a half-baked announcement from a government paralysed by chaos and incompetence. It is not a plan to live well with COVID. Thank you.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I really thought this was going to be the moment when he would end his run of making the wrong call on every single one of the big decisions. But, Mr. Speaker, time and time again, he's had the chance to back the government on the big decisions, and I'm afraid that he's got it wrong.
Well, joining me in a second to look at the statistics, because you might be aware by now, there's a lot of people saying, hang on a minute, this isn't about medical positions, this is about politics. So before we get into that conversation about what it is about, let's have a look, shall we, at what the picture actually is when it comes to the statistics in England. Jamie Jenkins, who's the former head of health statistics at the ONS, joins me now. Jamie, good evening to you. Help me understand, if you will, what is the picture when it comes to COVID in England?
Yeah, evening, Michelle. I think things are pretty positive at the moment. If you start looking at the facts and figures across the country, we had that massive rise in December with the Omicron wave. There's still a lot of testing, even though the number of tests have come down over the last 6 weeks. We're still doing a lot of testing across the country. We've had over 800,000 tests per day on average reported over the last 7 days across the country. And if you start looking underneath what the figures are, then there's different ways of looking at the facts and figures. So the first one you can look at is what percentage of tests that are carried out. So these are the tests that are done every single day. What percent are coming back positive? And it's around 10.5%. Now that's down from around 30% early January. So you've seen a significant drop there, which kind of indicates that fewer people are kind of testing positive if they're going forward for tests. And these are the PCR tests now, not the lateral flow tests that people can do. Then if you look at the ONS data with the ONS survey, which kind of there's random surveys of people across the country to try and understand the underlying prevalence. Cases have been coming down there as well. They've estimated about 4% of the population of England have got it. But I think we've got to move beyond the cases. That's just a little summary of what they are. If we look at hospitalisations, we've got the lowest number of patients now in hospital in ventilated beds since July. And we know that more and more people are going into hospital with Omicron or with COVID, but not actually being treated for it. And if you just forget COVID a second and just look at the NHS capacity in critical care over the winter, we saw no more patients really this winter. In fact, there were fewer patients in hospital in critical care this winter than we had in 3 of the 4 winters pre-pandemic. So we kind of moved beyond what we saw last winter, and things are looking pretty positive.
And where do we stand, Jamie, in terms of, sage predictions? Because, of course, we've heard lots of doom and gloom. Where do we sit in terms of how we were predicted to sit right now in England?
Yeah, so Boris was obviously asked to put in further restrictions before Christmas, and Sage was saying if we didn't do that, then we would see potentially deaths up to nearly 2,890 a day in England around the middle to the end of January. And the good thing is we obviously never got anywhere near that, and Boris didn't bring the restrictions in. We actually, with the ONS data, we can look at where we actually ended up, and it was closer to 200. Now, some people may say, well, 200 is still too many per day. But I suppose the thing to remind people is that people sadly do die every single day of the week. And what we're seeing with mortality at the moment across the country is deaths. The total number of deaths are no different to what we were seeing pre-pandemic. So in the latest week's data, Michelle, we've actually seen that deaths are lower than what we had in 2018, 2017 and 2015. So all the indicators are starting to kind of show life beyond the pandemic is what we knew it.
Jamie Jenkins, thanks very much for your insights. Now, I'll start with you, Dan Hodges, on the panel tonight. What are your thoughts in this? And I guess, particularly from the perspective of some people are saying this is Boris Johnson engineering this situation for political gain, as opposed to the right thing to do when it comes to the situation with COVID, health, etc.
Well, I mean, I think there's certainly some politics behind it. I mean, Boris has obviously been under pressure from a significant section of his party to make this move. But I don't think that's what lays behind it. I think, frankly, this is now the right time to lift the restrictions. And I'd turn it back and say, if we're not going to lift the restrictions now, then when are we going to? I mean, we just heard the statistics there. We all saw the very dire predictions that were made by the experts or supposed experts before Christmas about the impact Omicron was going to have. We were told it was the greatest threat of the pandemic to date. And it simply wasn't. And I think, frankly, there is obviously going to be some debate over the next few days. And we've got the press conference this evening. It'll be interesting to see what the experts say at that. But I think, frankly, Boris didn't have any choice, because I think those who were warning about the impact of Omicron and warning about the impact of COVID over the winter and at the start of this year have now been so discredited that it would have been very, very difficult to see on what evidence base, given the actual figures we're seeing. He obviously can't rely on projections anymore. He can't rely on predictions anymore. It's very difficult to see what other decision he could have taken, to be honest.
Indeed. Scarlett, your thoughts? Liam has been in touch with me on the email saying, Michelle, why does Serkia only ask for evidence when it comes to removing restrictions? I guess his point there, Scarlett, is, all we've ever heard is deeper, faster. Why didn't we do this sooner? Why now, all of a sudden, when it comes to Labour, are the stats so important?
Actually, I think that's unfair. I think the stats have always been important, and I think, everybody I know in the Labour Party is desperate to get out of the restrictions. I wouldn't call this a plan, though. And what's so difficult about this is, of course, we've got to start living with COVID. And of course, while Omicron is incredibly infectious, she says, having caught it, it's not nearly as dangerous as anybody thought. That's one of the things. But what I do not understand is why we don't wear masks on the tube, because that, I went on a bus having had surgery and I caught COVID. And that is the problem, is I know a lot of people...
How do you know you caught COVID on this bus, by the way? You've told me this bus story before.
I've told you the bus story before, because everybody else who came to see me had taken a test, right? And nobody else had it. So it's obvious that people are catching COVID on public transport. And I know a lot of people who will never go back to it now. And that's the problem, is that it's fine for all of us, right? We can do what we want. But I do worry about the vulnerable. And I don't want us to be in lockdown. I don't want us ever to be in lockdown again. I think restrictions need to be lifted. I do not understand, as you know, the problem that people have wearing masks on the tube.
I don't wear them. I don't like them at all. I don't think they're very effective. I don't like the way they restrict my communication. And in a sentence, I find them unnecessary. So I don't wear them. And that's my reasons why. But James, Scarlett's saying there that this doesn't sound like much of a plan. She's referring to the fact Keir Starmer responded to Boris Johnson and said it's not a plan. Well, it is a plan. I've got my dates here and what's going to happen when. And this is one of the problems with this whole predicament of these last 2 years. People have become absolutely dependent on being told, handheld, kind of, you can do this, you can't do this. Get on with your life. You don't need the government to tell you can sit on a park bench or you can't, or put this on your face or don't. I think people have been a bit brainwashed. Am I wrong?
Well, I think we all go in for a bit of brainwashing, Michelle, but the important thing is that, if I'm not mistaken, that Boris talked about restoring our freedoms, but also, him giving them back. And I think it's a most preposterous idea. Freedoms are not for him to give back. Your point about individual responsibility is right. It's our perceptions and our freedoms to take, not his to give back. I also contest the idea of living with COVID. I mean, do we talk about living with flu or living with cancer, which is a much more virulent kind of problem for this country? We don't talk about that, but we single out COVID.
Well, people will say, well, hang on, because cancer's not contagious.
Yes, but it's a mass killer in a way that COVID doesn't promise to be. And can we therefore get a sense of proportion that it is a virulent disease that affects a minority and a decreasing minority, as your ONS man said, and can we stop, chewing on it like a dog with a bone, that we just can't seem to free ourselves from the mentality. I think what's really at issue here, if I may say, Michelle, is that it's gone beyond the numbers. It's about whether you care or not. If you cavil and insist that restrictions must stay, you're a good person. You care for people. You care for the vulnerable. If you say what Dan said or what I said, you're uncaring. Let it rip, and so on. This is not the case, and it's very unfair.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I say this story all the time, but my son's nursery, when you go in, it has posters on the wall saying wearing a mask is kindness. And I actually think that is appalling. Obviously, my son can't read, but I don't wear a mask. But if I didn't wear a mask, I don't appreciate my child then sitting there going, Mummy, are you not caring? Are you not kind? Because that's the other thing it says, wearing a mask is kindness. And it's kind of like, it's not about kindness or being a nice person. It's about the effectiveness and the necessity for these measures. And my worry is, Scarlett, my concern in all of this, I do think we've got a plan. My concern is, are people going to follow it? Because I suspect, and I don't think I'm going to be wrong, that you're still going to have all these organisations and places, shops, companies, whatever, that still insist on these ridiculous measures.
Yeah, let's go back. If you wear a mask, you're helping other people and not yourself. That's the interesting thing about wearing a mask. I'm sure.
But you had your mask on and it didn't stop you catching COVID, you said.
It didn't. That absolutely is because other people weren't wearing masks. Is if you wear a mask, you're helping other people. That's the whole point. In hospitals, I assume they will go on wearing masks, right? I assume that in some shops they'll go on wearing masks. Interestingly, I came today on the tube. Fewer people than normal, but about half the people. And interesting, a lot of young men were wearing masks.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate then, because this is, I genuinely don't understand your sentiment. I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I'm not trying to be on thingy. But you're telling me if you get on a train, so if me and you get on a train together and I don't wear a mask, you think I'm being irresponsible?
I think that if you and I get on a train together, and either of us could have COVID without symptoms, then if we're not wearing a mask, we're more likely to spread it.
So then this is my devil's advocate thing. Why aren't you wearing a mask now then?
Because you can't wear a mask. I wear a mask on public transport, right? I wear masks in shops.
Wait a minute.
But this is where I don't see the science. How come you're only going to spread it if you don't wear a mask on a train?
Well, of course I'm not going to wear it here because I'm speaking. I mean, you said yourself masks. Look, I hate masks, right? If you want the truth, I really, every time I walk out of a tube station, I rip off my mask with pleasure. I only wear it because I think it's the responsible thing to do. Here, why would I bother to wear it with you three? Honestly, do I care if I give you COVID? I am the safest person. I am the safest person in this room. I had it 2 weeks ago.
I thought TfL had determined that there was no COVID to be found on the tube system and that they did that some months ago. So can we stop obsessing about to mask or not to mask? There are bigger issues than COVID, even in the world of medicine, let alone the worlds that we're going to explore in the next few
Well, I don't actually think there's many bigger issues than personal liberties, personal responsibilities, which is why, because someone just messaged in as well, your email's just flown straight down the chain, so I don't have your name to hand, but someone's messaged in saying, oh, Michelle, pack it in talking about COVID. Trust me, if you watch this show, you will be clear that I cannot bear the whole COVID thing. The second that I don't have to think about it or speak about it, I'll open whatever it is over there in that decanter and I'll be drinking it live on air and cheering and celebrating. However, that is not that moment, because we do have to talk about it, because some of you people, by the way, that live in Scotland or Wales, by the way, you'll be watching this saying, well, hang on a second, because we still have a lot of restrictions. And Dan, maybe I'm being a bit facetious when I'm asking about why Scarlett's not wearing a mask here, but my point is, this doesn't make sense to me. People want you to, if you're going to be here, you must wear a mask so that you're responsible and kind. It doesn't matter there, though, or it doesn't matter there. It makes none of these things make any sense to me. I just think it's become ridiculous.
Well, I think the problem with masks, I think one of the things about masks is it does highlight what I was saying earlier. If you remember at the start of the COVID crisis, the same experts who we are told we should listen to tonight, when they say we are opening up too soon. They're the same experts who were very explicitly telling us masks would not make any difference at all to this, and since then it's become this sort of totemic issue. I mean, what I would say is, I mean, I do think, throughout the course of this there has been this huge, rightly, this huge debate about civil liberties, about why the government was introducing these measures. And I remember having, countless arguments with people on social media who were saying, you watch, the government are going to keep us in these restrictions for perpetuity. And I kept asking just precisely why it was Boris would seek to do that. I think the one thing is that issue has now been resolved this evening. It is quite clear the restrictions are going. I don't see any circumstance where the restrictions will come back.
Lots of people want them back down there.
Yeah, lots of people want them back. And throughout the crisis, the vast majority of the public, in all the opinion polls, have supported the restrictions. But the reality is, as we've seen tonight, the great conspiracy theory, which actually this wasn't a public health measure, but it was some sort of measure that was being introduced by maligned politicians like Boris because they wanted to, force us into some sort of slavery. That's not actually happened. And what we're seeing is, I said this earlier, undoubtedly throughout this crisis, mistakes have been made. But it was an unprecedented public health crisis. It was an unprecedented global public health crisis. And I think the restrictions that were introduced, by and large, were understandable. But I equally think that if you are to argue that they should continue at this point, when all the evidence is clear about where we are in the virus cycle, then I think that would not be proportionate.
Well, I've got to say, lots of you completely disagree with my sentiment on masks. One of you, I think it's Keith, said, if you don't stop talking about masks, Michelle, I'm not going to watch your programme anymore. Well, Keith, there is a variety of different views on this panel, as always. I'm very strong in mine. People like Scarlett are also very strong in their opposite view. Someone else, Louis, I think you're called Louis anyway. You've written in and said, I have cancer, Michelle, so I'm one of the vulnerable during this pandemic. I'm sorry to hear that. I obviously take precautions, but that would be true irrespective of COVID. It's time to open up. This is Keith. Sorry, Keith. I don't know who Louis is. It's time to open up completely, he says. I don't want my illness to stifle the lives of others, and it's up to me to manage my situation and mitigate any risks. Adrian says, wearing a mask is not ridiculous, Michelle. I have to say, lots of you have that sentiment. Joyce says, yes, I feel very happy. Let's get on with it. Anne says, I'm over the moon that restrictions are gone. And Paul says, do you think this means that GPs will actually hold face-to-face surgeries now? Whoa there, Paul. Let's not get silly. I mean, come on. Although if you do have a GP that is seeing you face-to-face, get in touch with me and let me know. The poll that we're running on social media, by the way, that I've asked, do you think England is ready to live with COVID? You can see a graphic on the screen for those watching. Currently, the results are 92% of you say yes, and no is 8% of you. I have to say, by the way, and I don't wish to be flippant, because I know that lots of you, or some of you at least, will have people in your family that are vulnerable. Some of you yourselves might be. And I know that in that case, some of you may be frightened. If you are, get in touch with me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, and let me know your thoughts. Going to take a quick break. When we come back, even though James wants to continue this conversation, I can see him at the corner of my eye itching to come back in, but no, James. We're going to talk about MI5 when we come back. Apparently, the UK faces the fight to keep our way of life as Russia and China wage a war for international supremacy. We'll be discussing that and more in a couple of minutes.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, welcome back to Dewbs & Co with me, Michelle Dewberry. My panel tonight is Dan Hodges, a commentator at The Mail on Sunday, Scarlett Maguire, who's a former Labour advisor, and James Woodhousen, who's a visiting professor at London South Bank University. Nigel has emailed in saying, Michelle, why don't you wear a blue rosette on your shows? You are obviously so pro-Tory. It is embarrassing. That's what Nigel says. Nigel, I've got to just point out to you, though, my friend, in the last 2 general elections, I've actually stood against the Tories. So you might want to think about that one there. Anyway, let's talk, shall we, about the MI5. Why? Well, the head of this massively secret organisation, Ken McCallum, he's done an interview, and in the interview, it was with the Daily Mail, he says the UK faces a fight to keep our way of life. He's warned us that Russia and China are waging an all-encompassing contest for international supremacy, seeking to interfere in Parliament, shape public thoughts and steal from businesses, universities and ordinary Britons. He's also added that the MI5 is being hamstrung by outdated laws which make it impossible to prosecute foreign spies. McCallum has also warned that Russia and China are both desperate to gain a foothold in the House of Commons by targeting MPs and their advisers. This all comes at a time, of course, when today Defence Secretary Ben Wallace said that we have strong cause for concern that Russia are on the brink of an invasion of Ukraine. Scarlett Maguire, what do you think to this whole kind of concept that we have to fight to keep our way of life?
I think the most important thing he said was, we want to change the law because it doesn't work for us. And this is just a lobbying exercise. I mean, I am old enough, probably unlike anybody else here, to remember the red peril, the yellow peril. You know, I mean, actually, I lived in Moscow as a child. My dad was a spy out there. I then was in the States for the Bay of Pigs. I mean, we have been through this over and over again.
I did not know some of these interesting facts about you.
I have a show just on that.
Yeah, but I mean, I just...
Your dad was a Russian spy?
No,
presumably not our spy.
He was an right. Okay, I'm keeping up. He was an English spy.
It was
Moscow,
not a secret if you're in. I mean, he was in military intelligence. He was a. I mean, everybody knew. And the
they know now.
No, you're accredited. You're accredited.
You're accredited.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely, James, you're absolutely right. I mean, everybody knew. Yes, I know. But I honestly... MI5 go on and on and on about, they've gone on always about, you know, we're worried about Russia, we're worried about this, give us more money, change the law so that we can do this. I mean, nothing changes. No. And to then say we're worried about what's going on in Parliament, it was ever thus. Look at, you know, a lot of scandals have been about, you know, who's in bed with, literally in bed with the Russians. I just can't take it seriously.
Really? But James, there is something going on here. I mean, the more that we're talking about, for example, I mean, if I think about Russia and Ukraine, the more that we're talking about sanctions this and sanctions that, the more Russia will start getting into bed, to quote Scarlett, with people like China. And that does increase the risk to us in terms of, I mean, we've just been talking, I was introing it in there, in terms of cyber attacks and all things like that. Russia and China joining forces against us is not what we should be trying to encourage.
Well, back up there, Michelle. I mean, it's true that the evacuation of Afghanistan can only have encouraged that alliance. It's also true that both are up to no good on English soil. You know, murder in the case of Russian military intelligence, the GRU, and, you know, the suborning of MPs in the case of China in particular. But it's not always the same, Scarlett. What is new is the head of the intelligence services coming on TV to promote his lobbying. What is new is the use of intelligence as a sort of propaganda weapon like never before over the Ukraine thing. You know, we know what Putin's thinking. We know when he's invading. We're going to surface this and so on. So
I think Kennedy did it over the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah, but, you know, it's 50 years on from that.
I know.
It's 60 years on from that. So, you know, we have to wonder whether a further incursion by the state, not especially more sinister than ever before, but a further incursion by the state in demanding this and demanding that and scarifying the other, you the real threat to our way of life is not just a murder or subornment. And there you're right, Scarlett. The real threat to our way of life is our inability to develop ideas about the future and something that can get us out of the hole that we're in. And at the level of ideas, I fear our woke friends are winning the battle for the future.
What do you mean?
That undermines us.
What
that
do you mean?
undermines our security, and it undermines our ability to confront new rising powers, such as China in particular. We don't have the ideological apparatus to cohere people for the kind of actions that we need to take.
Dan Hodges,
yeah,
you're being very polite. I know, Scarlett, you want to come back, but just Dan.
No, well, I mean, firstly, I wouldn't necessarily describe Vladimir Putin as an classic example of woke culture. And whilst I agree with you on,
what do you mean?
That we have. Well,
that's not what I'm talking about.
Well, no, but I mean, there is obviously a very real and present threat to this country and other free countries from Putin's expansionism and Chinese expansionism, neither of which I think are necessarily being undermined by wokeism. And I think equally, whilst I agree with you that we have to win the battle of ideas, it's quite hard to win the battle of ideas if those of us that are coming up with ideas find foreign states coming into our country and murdering people, within our own borders. And that has to be defended, and that has to be defended robustly. Where I would agree, I mean, you were saying about, obviously your very interesting experiences. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when we didn't know who the head of MI5 was. I mean, it was a national secret who the head of MI5 was. We didn't even know we didn't even admit there was an MI5 at one point. So, and I do agree, I'm slightly concerned at the way the head of MI5 now feels he has to get into the public relations game. I mean, I think we were talking about COVID before. I think one of the problems that we've seen throughout the whole COVID experience is the way some of the experts have become a little bit seduced by their own celebrity, and I think that has slightly distorted some of the picture, and I wouldn't want to see that happening in the case of the security services. I also think, actually, particularly at a very, very sensitive time, obviously, as we're all aware of in terms of diplomatic relationships, the picture of the head of the domestic intelligence service pontificating about the actions of foreign governments, whilst well-meaning, I'm not sure I'm entirely comfortable that the timing with this and the tone of those comments it necessarily matches the moment.
Do you want to come back?
Well, I'm
briefly, though, if you will. I want to talk about gambling as well.
Gambling.
I do.
The thing is the threat to our way of life bigger from Salisbury attacks and Chinese suborning of MPs, or from the Scottish National Party's decision to allow basically 13-year-old sex?
Well, look. I mean,
what's the threat?
I hold no candle to the SNP. But if you're talking about whether or not who is the greater threat at the moment to not just our way of life, but the life of all of us who live in sort of Western democracies, I don't think you can really compare Nicola Sturgeon to Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, look, Vladimir Putin, both the Russian and the Chinese are absolutely terrible. I mean, what Vladimir Putin is doing to the Ukraine, is about to do to Ukraine, is terrifying. There's been a civil war going on there, with 14,000 deaths for the last 6 years. I mean, it is absolutely appalling. He is playing brinksmanship. He's doing, ghastly. The Chinese, I mean, what they're doing to the Uyghurs, we allow them to have a whole Winter Olympics without saying what is going on in China.
Well, they stopped
and
the
then you
diplomats
talk
going there,
about
don't they?
wokeism, right? These are the problems. And I mean, what's so interesting is it's really not about our way of life. I mean, it's not as though these are socialist systems or anything. I mean, Vladimir is as much Putin is
I don't think we need a lesson in that.
Right. So, and I mean, the weird thing about the Chinese is he says, they're doing the MPs, and you think, Who in their right mind would spend money on Barry Gardner?
Well, yeah, there you go. What a poignant point to end it on. I've got to say, James, I do think you're onto something there, though, when you talk about the SNP and some of the lunacies that's going on in Scotland. And
to our way of life. That's what
you've teed it up nicely, because that is one of the things I want to talk about tomorrow, actually. Some of the, what I would call bonkers things that are going on in Scotland at the moment. But you'll have to stay tuned for tomorrow instead, because right now I want to talk about gambling. The NHS Mental Health Director, Claire Murdoch, has announced gambling industry funding for addiction clinics are going to be stopped. But the NHS has claimed it's going to fully fund 2 new specialist clinics in May to help face a record demand for serious gambling addiction. The decision, get this, it follows feedback from the patients and clinicians that are opposing the conflict of interest from the gambling industry, which generates profits, by the way, of over £14 billion a year. It got me thinking, this one. As I said earlier on in my intro, there's over 2 million people in the UK that are thought to have a problem with gambling. Of course, I'm not suggesting that they all need to go into NHS treatment, but a number of them do. And personally, I do believe, actually, that the gambling industry should indeed be responsible for helping at least part fund some of these treatments. Scarlett Maguire, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, clearly the gambling industry doesn't just help this addiction, or it isn't an accident. I mean, the gambling industry feeds gambling addiction. We know that. They take addicts, they persuade addicts to go and think. I do think it matters where the money comes from, because it means that the gambling industry are in there. I mean, if you're paying for something, you're saying how it should be promoted, how it should work. I completely understand that gambling addicts actually want to go somewhere to get away from gambling, not something that's paid by the industry.
And you know, the last time we did this, and I think you might have even been on.
I was. I think they're scum.
But the reason I bring it up is because if my memory serves me correct, and I think it does, when we spoke about gambling, and you were saying exactly what you just said then, these companies are scum, I had so many viewers right into me saying, well, hang about, because actually when you look back in history and you look at the Labour Party's contribution towards the gambling industry, people were telling me, and please remind me if you were one of them telling me, because I'm sure you'll email again that we're talking about it, actually fueled the expansion of things like betting shops. And people were really taking issue with that.
No, I mean, and I think they're right. And I think Tony Blair was totally wrong about it, actually.
Gordon Brown as well.
Gordon
Brown.
I mean, what they said was that I mean, basically, they were lobbied by the gambling industry. The gambling industry was very successful, and they had this view that if you didn't allow the gambling industry to set up their shops, then everything would go online. They were completely wrong. It was wrong of them to do it. And yeah, I mean, the Labour government did not get everything right, as I'm sure Dan would agree.
Dan? Do you agree?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right in terms of the facts. I mean, I think it was Gordon, wasn't it, who came up with the idea of the super casinos. But no, I mean, I've got to be honest. No, I don't agree with this. I think this description of the gambling industry as scum is frankly ludicrously over the top. I mean, there are millions and millions of people in this country who enjoy a bet, they enjoy going to the races, they enjoy betting on sport, and in terms of the great panoply of terrible activity that people engage in, I actually think gambling is pretty low down the list. And I think
I'm talking about the companies. I'm not talking about the people who do it. I'm talking about the companies who go on feeding it, who take the addicts and persuade them to spend more money. I think it's terrible.
There are two things. You can't divorce, in a sense, the activity from the people who do it, and you can't simply say, well, I think that the provision of this, the people who provide this services are scum, but those who access this and enjoy access
how they provide them. Dan, we know that they encourage problem gamblers to spend more money.
But look, there have been issues within the gambling sector, and the gambling industry are quite clearly doing stuff to address that, which is how this segment was framed. I mean, this segment was framed by saying the gambling industry are attempting to provide practical assistance.
Well, no,
to
hang on.
people
They have
who
to get in order to get their licence. They're compelled access of 0.1% of their things to gamble away on people.
They are providing practical assistance to people who suffer from gambling addiction. When they provide that assistance, they're attacked for providing that assistance, and people turn around and say, "We don't want money."
It's rejected. The assistance has been rejected by the NHS. It is that, to me, that I find absolutely bonkers. James?
Well, I wish more often on these discussions in life, Michelle, we interrogated the category. You know, what is the category? Addiction. Are we really saying that gambling is an addiction? You know, there are problem gamblers. I think there are about 300,000 in the country altogether. According to the ONS, their number is not increasing. Now, are we saying it's chemically addictive or biologically founded or whatever?
Well, some people will say an addiction is a medical illness, yes, whether that's to tobacco, alcohol, gambling, whatever.
Yeah, but what we're denying in that scenario is adult responsibility, the fun which Dan talks about, the fact that I went to Mecca Bingo in Halifax a few years ago and I made a full recovery from the habit I developed. You missed that one, Michelle.
No, I didn't. No, I didn't miss it.
You know,
no, I didn't miss it.
People recover from these problems.
No, I didn't miss it. I just didn't think it was funny because you've been to Mecca Bingo, as I've been to Mecca Bingo. You want to see me at Mecca Bingo? In fact, I have all the different books and I have Dabber and I'm awesome at it. But that's fine because I don't have a problem. If you're someone who has an addiction, and I'm familiar with alcohol addiction. I'm not familiar with gambling addiction, but there are people. Is it the same? Well, there are people, and you might be watching actually, or you might be affected, or you might know of an addict. Because the problem is with some of these addictions, they take a hold not only just of the addict's life, by the way, James, the whole kind of system around them, the families.
Yeah, well, this is well known, but you know, do we want to medicalise the problem? Do we want to deny their adult responsibility? Could we think about better jobs or better leisure facilities or all the other factors or the family relationships that bring about these things? Can we not go to the root of the problem rather than just medicalising it, talking about dependency and being addicted to the metaphor of addiction? That's what I oppose, Michelle, because we're supposed to be shopaholics, chocoholics, addicted to sex, addicted to nearly everything. I don't think that's true. I think it's demeaning of people.
Well, there you go. Let me throw that open to you at home, the viewers. What do you think there? To James's point, I'll end on that one, actually. Do you think that addiction is actually a medical thing that people have no control over, or do you think it's just basically all in the mind and people need to... I hope I'm not paraphrasing you. I was just about to say get a grip, but I didn't want to insult him, but he just said it himself. Snap out of it. There you go. If you are an addict or if you've been affected by an addict, do you think you can control it, or it could have been controlled? GBviews at gbnews.uk, or tweet me at Michelle Dewbs or at GBnews. Going to take a quick break. When we come back, I'll be reading out some of your emails that you've been sending in, because there's been lots, I can tell you. And I also want to talk to you about universities. Do you reckon students should have been continuing to pay full fees throughout this whole pandemic, whilst getting what some might say is a substandard service of remote learning, etc.? We'll have that conversation and more coming up.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Michelle Dewberry. This is Dewbs & Co. Just a reminder, my panel, Dan Hodges, who's a commentator at the Mail on Sunday, Scarlett Maguire, who's a former Labour advisor, and James Woodhousen, who's the visiting professor at London South Bank University. I've got to say, we continued our conversation into the break about whether or not addiction is something that people can control or not. Let me know your thoughts. Kevin in Wales says that actually I believe it is connected to our genetics. I wouldn't blame chemicals in the brain, but he does kind of go on to say that he thinks that people inherit addictions. What do you think to that? Can you inherit, say, I don't know, say if your dad's an alcoholic, can you inherit being an addiction? Being an addiction, I don't mean addiction, I mean being an alcoholic. Sue says, Michelle, I couldn't believe this when I heard that the NHS are not taking the industry's money and funding it themselves. We simply cannot afford this, and I think it's madness. I completely agree with you, Sue. Carol says, what about addictions to masks? Is that a chemical problem in the brain? David says there's a very simple solution to all of this gambling stuff, Michelle. If the bookies treated losers the way that they treat winners, there simply would be no problem, because you'd win a few bob and then they'd do all that they could to stop you again. That's Dave. Let me know your thoughts. Keep them coming in. But for now, I want to talk to you about universities. By the way, before I get into universities, I do want to just flag to you that Boris Johnson will be taking the stage about 7 o'clock, so about 10 minutes' time. If you are someone who's been missing those kind of next slide, please, press conferences. By the way, I've never quite understood that, because in today's day and age, why don't they just have clickers to do their own slides? Never understood that. Anyway, I digress. My point is, we will be showing the press conference live as soon as it starts, so don't worry about that. But for now, I want to talk to you about universities. Some universities have been urged to give students a refund. It follows figures from a Freedom of Information request that looked at basically how much money some of these universities have been making. Russell Group, for example, and a reported £2.2 billion over the pandemic, and have experienced the biggest increase in student numbers for more than 10 years. Now, I've got to say, I'll start with you on this, James, actually, because you are a visiting professor, which sounds very important, at a university. What do you think to this? Students have continued paying their full fees, which can be, about 10 grand a year in some places. Do you think they've actually received value for money during that period? I don't, but what's your thoughts?
Well, certainly not. You know, the whole conduct of the Russell Group is entirely disreputable. The university of which I'm a part has nothing to do in it, and I think that's right.
I've got to say, I think they would disagree with that sentiment, but...
Well, they can disagree as much as they like, but the fact is that they've, withheld proper learning from students, withheld enormous quantities of money from students, and now, there's a campaign to persuade them to, make amends, and it's long overdue. And their snooty conduct and their representation of a temporary necessity as a virtue, and so on, namely distance learning, something which, in fact, follows for their whole conception and the government's conception of students not as the subjects of education, but as consumers. Well, if they are consumers, I don't believe that they should be, but if they are consumers, then they have, just this once, in my judgment, consumer rights to get their cash back and have a decent service. Thank you very much. You're entirely right, Michelle.
Thank you, James. I like that. Should we end the show early there? Well, just on that point, I'm entirely right. I like that. Just kidding. Dan, your thoughts?
No, I've got some sympathy. I mean, again, it comes back to the discussion we were having before. I mean, the remote learning was set against a backdrop in which the government were telling us all to stay at home, to work from home, to minimise our contact. And I think to specifically sort of single out the universities in that instance would be wrong. What I would say, though, is moving forward, I mean, we can say this across the board. You can say it in relation to the universities. We could, obviously, the other hot issue is GP appointments. There is no justification from today for any more restrictions on how universities engage with their students or how GPs engage with their patients. You know, the pandemic, to all intents and purposes, is over now, and they have an obligation to act on that basis. And if they continue to shortchange their students in terms of their learning, then at that point, I think they should be penalised.
Scarlett, very briefly, if you will, because we're almost out of time. It flies when you're having fun, but briefly, your thoughts?
My thoughts is that the students have been deprived of a proper student experience and
an education.
And an education, but the education is much broader than just having lectures, James. And I just think, I think that actually that I've always felt that COVID hit the young the most, because actually, if you're 17. You never get to be 17 again. Whereas, you know, if you're married and in your 40s, you just lose a year. But you never get it. And those kids who are at university and they've graduated and they just haven't had it properly, I think it's absolutely terrible. And they certainly did not get £9,000 worth.
Correct.
Stuart says, Michelle, I do love you to bits, but you waffle, and then you waffle, and then you run out of time. So can you stop it ASAP? Stuart, I tell you what, I'm going to try really hard. When I get home, I'm going to practice reducing my waffling just for you. I can tell you, lots of you, by the way, including Tony, have been in touch saying that addiction is an illness. I might have this conversation another day, actually, because I think it sparks a lot of interesting points. But for now, that is all I've got time for. Have yourself a good evening. I'll see you tomorrow. And Stuart, I promise I'll work on my waffling just for you.
Good evening. Storm Franklin may have cleared away, but the weather remains pretty lively. We're going to see a spell of heavy rain sinking south quite quickly during tomorrow, and further strong winds throughout this week, although not as stormy as last week. The most recent storm, Franklin, has cleared away. A brief bump in the isobars, bringing many a fine evening. But here come the next set of weather fronts. This already introducing cloud and patchy rain to Northern Ireland. That'll trickle into western Scotland. Further east with clear skies, those winds ease off. Turning quite chilly out there, but actually temperatures tending to rise as we go through the night as the cloud moves in. And so we start to see some heavy rain for western Scotland, Northern Ireland by morning, and the winds then start to pick up here once more. On to Tuesday's details. It generally starts pretty grey. Heavy rain early on for Northern Ireland and southern Scotland, but it's pretty much gone by rush hour. It will be quite wet across northern England and Wales. That rain tending to fizzle out as it slips through the Midlands and then turns things a bit damp across East Anglia and the southeast for the early afternoon. Sunny skies will follow. So will a few showers, mostly over northwest England, a few for Northern Ireland, plenty for western Scotland, where there'll be snow over the hills. Those wintry showers will keep going through Tuesday evening. Otherwise, many places dry and clear and with light winds again. It'll turn quite cold. And then the next weather front arrives in the northwest, again picking the winds up here once more and bringing more rain across much of Scotland as we start Wednesday. Through the day on Wednesday, that rain will spread into Northern Ireland. Much of England and Wales looking dry on Wednesday. A few showers in the west, quite a bit of cloud here, but some sunny spells likely across the east. But it will be a blustery day once more on Wednesday. Again, not as windy as today, but nevertheless noticeable, 8, 9, 10 Celsius, but feeling colder with those gusty winds. So windy this week, but not as stormy. Further spells of rain, but there will be some sunnier days as well. Goodbye.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly